Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and the first episode of a new mini-series here on the podcast, the life and Sfarim of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, the author of Tshuva Me'ava and other Sfarim. This episode and this series is being sponsored by Machon Netzach Yaakov, who is publishing the new edition of Tshuva Me'ava, and they published the other Sfarim of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, Elosh Chodesh Rishon, Sheni Shlishi, Chazoin L'Moyed, Avos David, as well as the Haggadah Meister Rabbi Elazar. And now they're publishing Tshuva Me'ava in this monumental new project, as well as an additional volume from Ksav Yad, printed for the first time on Even Ezer. So with that, we thought that it's a good opportunity to discuss Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, the Talmud Muvak of Noda B'Yehuda, and a fascinating figure in his own right. For those, many are familiar with him, and some are not, so I think it's a good opportunity to talk about him. Also, Machon Netzach Yaakov, they're publishing Imrei Piv Ala Torah soon, Shalosh Shuvos Eila Shmuel Chelik Aleph, Shalosh Shuvos Eila Shmuel Chelik Beis, and they've published recently Berachas Toiv and many other Sfarim. They're publishing always in nice new critical editions. They published 2 Sfarim for David Oppenheim and a number of other Sfarim on various different topics. So for this episode, the first episode in the series discussing the biography, we'll go through the life of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles. I'll be joined once again by Rabbi Moshe Maimon. So thank you, Rabbi Moshe, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much, Nachi, and thank you, Machon Netzach Yaakov. It's a great opportunity. Many Lamdanim know the Tshuva Me'ava through the notes on Noda B'Yehuda. The Machon Yerushalayim's classic edition of the Tshuva's Noda B'Yehuda includes a lot of notes from Rabbi Elazar Fleckles. He is... Of course, a mechaber in his own right, but the closest Talmud Noda B'Yehuda, and many of the tshuvas in his sefer are from and to the Noda B'Yehuda. So primarily, his exposure is as a Talmud of Noda B'Yehuda, but a very able mamshich darkei of the Noda B'Yehuda in every respect. The Noda B'Yehuda was the Ish HaSholem with a shlita in Torah and Hashkafa and Agada and the ultimate leader, the ultimate Rav. And Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is a very capable successor, and he epitomizes many of those same milas, as we'll see. His Sfarim are fascinating. He himself was fascinating and a true Gadol B'Yisrael.
We should start off mentioning that his name is Elazar, not Eliezer. Sometimes, once in a while, you'll see people write Eliezer. His name is Elazar. Also, Fleckles, that's, I think, how it's pronounced, and either has a sin at the end or a samach. I've seen it done both ways. Just spelling out of the way. So, we'll talk about his biography. We'll start with Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, who was born in Prague. This is a native Pragian, if you will, in 1754. And Ramesh, you want to pick up and you could talk about his early life.
Yeah, he's a big yachson in a world which is very much machshav yichus, especially Prague yichus. So his mother Chayesar, comes from also a very famous Rav in Prague, and that is the author of the Klei Yakar, Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz, who's a Rav in Prague, and Rabbi Elazar himself, his father on his father's side, Rabbi David, is an anacle of Rabbi David Gans, the Tzemach David, also from a famous Prague family. So he belongs to Prague royalty, and much of what we're going to say now comes from the biography written by his grandson called Zichron Elazar, and in there he says a fascinating story how as a young child he would go with his father every time there was a drush in shul. You know, we know that the Rav would give a drush. Sometimes there were other darshanim, the Magid or whatever passing through would give a drasha. But a drasha in the Altnoi shul was a very big occasion. He would go with his father to hear the drasha. And one day, after coming back from a drasha, a young Elazar tells his mother, Chayesara, he says, one day I'm going to give a drasha from the bima of the Altnoi shul. And that was a memory that stuck with her. And years later, when he indeed became the rabbi and became the Av Bezdin and darshan from the shul, that Nevuah was Mikuyim.
There's another person to mention of his yichus was Moshe Meir Perlis, who was one of the Chashuvei Prague. He wrote one sefer that we have called Megillah Sefer on Megillas Esther. This was reprinted a few years ago by Babov. It was very hard to get. They printed it for a chasana, and then they printed a few other ones were sold, but it was very hard. It's a beautiful sefer on Esther. There's actually some fascinating autobiographical information, some fascinating material on here. Bechlal, he talks about Reb David Oppenheim, and Reb David Oppenheim's daughter, I think, wrote a Megillah, and the question was if it was kosher. A woman writes a Megillah. Reb David said yes, and I think he said no. There's some fascinating material in this Megillah, and he is... Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is proudly a descendant of him. He talks about him extensively. He says he owned Sfarim of his in Ksav Yad, which we unfortunately lost, that we don't have anymore. So that's another one of. So he really, like you said, he was a real yachsin. And in a world where yichus was very important, there's something we always hear about yichus. Yichus was very important in those days. It was the elites, and the elite stayed elite, and it's rare to find someone coming from out of the elite, in fact. It's always elite families, and so you see that extensively. Also, Moshe, you mentioned in the Zichron Elazar, which anyone can find, it's a fascinating read. Also in the Machonet Yaakov, in the Svarim of the first few Svarim they printed of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, they have kind of a biography. It's taken from his words, plus the Zichron Elazar, plus Avas David. We could talk about in the new Chuvayava. There's going to be extensive, fleshed out a little more biography as well. For those interested, can read there as well. So we're taking from a couple different places. Okay, Ramesh, I'll turn it back to you.
One thought that just crossed my mind is that there's something unique about Prague. Prague, the community, was an official community with government recognition, and it had been there for very many years, which is why yichus plays such a role, because it's inherited. A lot of newer communities, everybody who comes is kind of an equal citizen, all everybody with equal rights and privileges. But in an older kind of place, like the Altanoi Shul was one of the oldest, maybe the oldest shul today, maybe the oldest shul in Europe. But it's a real, and that's how old the community was, and that's it's a feature of these old communities that people yarshin in a certain seat, they yarshin in certain positions, that everybody knows who they are because they go back. They're so he's a true blue blood in a positive sense, because it came with responsibilities as well. But the Yachsanim were very much aware of their yichus and what was expected of them.
As I recall from my trip to Prague, I think it's the oldest current active shul that is a minyan every day in Europe. Also, there wasn't only the Altanoi Shul. There's other shuls there. They're still there. You can see them. Sure. And there were other shuls. And as you'll see from his drushes, you can see from the Eilis Chodesh 1, 2, 3 and Chazan L'Mayid, he would darshan. He says he was in this shul. He was in the Meisel shul. He was in different shuls. They weren't only in one shuls. They were in different shuls giving the drushes. That he was a real, as you mentioned from the story already, he was a real preacher, if you will. So, okay, continue.
All right. So then, as a young child, he studies under Reb Moshe Roife Katz. He was a Kohen. Roife meant that he was a medical practitioner, which we don't know much about him. But Rabbi Elazar does memorialize him as someone with extremely dedicated to his job of teaching young children, and somebody with a great Yirah Shamayim who instilled in his young charges already at that age the importance of Yirah Shamayim. So that was very young. Probably he started learning at 6 years old, I think, in this cheder. After about 6 years, then he goes on to study under a very famous person in his own right, Rameir Fishelis. Rameir Fishelis himself, a Talmud of Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, a very famous person. He had a yeshiva there. Yeshiva meant for these young boys, bar mitzvah age boys. And not only did Rabbi Elazar learn there, but his father before him, Rabbi David, had learned there already back in 1735 for 10-year periods, only ending when Maria Theresa chased the Jews out of Bohemia. So that's when he left. And at that time, Reb Meir Fishelis took up, he became a Malamed in Kunstadt, but then he did return to Prague, and that's how Reb Elazar met him there. After graduating a few years later, he went on to learn under the Noda B'Yehuda, and that was to be his primary Rebbe for the rest of his life. And he speaks about, and Reb Elazar himself attributes learning from the Noda B'Yehuda not only Torah, but also learning Musar, Yirah Shamayim, and dealing very pleasantly with other people. That was important to the Noda B'Yehuda, and that was important to Rabbi Elazar because he learned under the Noda B'Yehuda. In 1770, when he's 16 years old, he gets married to another blue blood from Prague, the Bondi family. And it's Rabbi Avram Bondi's daughter Esther that he marries, and he stays on and continues learning in Prague up until the year 1779, when he becomes the rabbi of a small little community called Goitain. In Goitain is where he learns how to develop his darshanis ability, and he writes it, and then they're published. These drushes that he gave in this little town in this community of Goitain, he writes about how in his very first drusha, he gave the theme was something which would be a hallmark of his rabbanis, and that was that all members of the community, rich and poor, are going to be treated by the Rav as absolutely equal. And that's a big chiddush, because like you mentioned, the Achsonim, they all had certain rights and privileges. So the wealthy people also felt that they were entitled to certain rights and privileges, and that was standard throughout Europe. You read the memoir literature, that's like you said, the elites of the community, which were the Achsonim, plus the wealthy people. Wealth usually was inherited too, but wealth was the one way somebody might have a chance, of acquiring wealth and gaining status. But in the eyes of Rabbi Elazar, all are equal. And to keep himself busy, he learned, of course, and he continued his relationship with the Rabbi Yehuda, corresponding with all the time. And that's where these letters, many of the letters, he didn't need to write him a letter when he's learning in the Beis Medrash of the Rabbi Yehuda. Many of the letters go to this small 4 or 5 year period where he was in Goitain, corresponding with the Rabbi Yehuda. The grandson attests that this short period of the Rabbanus outside of Prague was marked with great success. Everybody in the community loved him. And in his last drasha, which is also published by Rabbi Elazar, he talks about how unusual for a rabbi. Already the Gemara says a rabbi that everyone loves may not be doing something right. But Rabbi Elazar mentions, and he was proud of it, how in this tenure he had the respect and the love of everybody. But what did bother him, and which is why eventually he left, is that he could not teach there. There was the holding a yeshiva in the old days, there was no tuition. The yeshiva was supported by the community, and a small community couldn't support a yeshiva. People, could give a little pittance. A little pittance from a large community would be enough to hold out a yeshiva on a very shoestring budget. That's the way the situation was in Europe. So the town like Goitain simply couldn't do it. So even though he's writing and he's corresponding and he's relating with the Rabbi Yehuda, but he feels something's missing in his life because he doesn't have the Beis Medrash. And that's why eventually he gives up his position and he returns to Prague, and that starts his glorious career in Prague.
In fact, to read a quote from him in the Tshuva Me'ava, and it's like Dama to Tshuva Me'ava, and Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is a phenomenal writer. Anyone that knows, that reads him, he's absolutely a wonderful writer. He writes Melitza, so using psukim and other flowery language that you might know from other areas, and he weaves it in. So once you get used to his style, it's easy to read, but right away, initially, you have to get used to it. So just to read a quote, not to overdo the quotes, but just to read, he says, "V'chol zeh inenu shaveh li." It wasn't worth anything to me to be there in Goitain. Ki nafshi choshko b'talmidim hamakshivim l'koili. I was yearning for talmidim that wanted to hear my voice. V'yirasi mipnei cherev alabadim. Scared of the cherev. Kol yomai gadalti b'diba chaverim upilpul talmidim. His whole life, you can imagine, Prague was one of the biggest Jewish cities in Europe. He was sitting there, you're sitting in Lakewood, and suddenly you go out some shtetl, some out-of-town shtetl. I miss that pilpul chaverim. I miss my friends. I miss being able to handle learning. Hitzikisani ruach bitni beteni meir gedoyle shel chachamim v'soifrim ani echacha uchol sheves galmud bilti based Talmud. How can I sit myself with nothing? There's no yeshiva. Ve'amarti, and I said elcha v'shuva el makaymi makam gedoyle v'toaviani dechakimi. So you see, he was homesick. Also, clearly, He missed Prague. He missed Rabbi Yehuda. He missed everything that was his friends there, and he wanted to go home, and he returned. He talks about this in other places as well, in his other farm, that he returned back to where he was. A couple other things to mention. Also, you mentioned Meir Fishalis, Rabbi Yehuda. So really, I think originally there was a Talmud of Meir Fishalis, and I think his father also was. So he really was. And what's interesting, and you see this in his farm as well to some extent, which is that he really was a native Pragian, and he really learned under Meir Fishalis in Prague. And then he also was a Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was from Poland. Rabbi Yehuda was Polish. So you have the kind of the two different. They weren't totally radically different, but they were different, Prague and Poland, and you see that combination in Rabbi Elazar Fleckles. And as you mentioned, many of the Shailas and the Tshuvas written in Tshuva Me'ava, rather, is when he was there in Goitain before he returned to Prague, which he returned to while the Rabbi Yehuda was still there. I think he returned and he gave a drasha. The Rabbi Yehuda was proudly watching. His Talmud gave a drasha there in Shul, and he came back. This is one of his, like I said, was Talmud. Many Talmud, but Talmud Mova came there. Okay,
and that, in fact, Nachi, that was the theme of his very first drasha, which is also preserved. But the very first drasha, the theme was that how everything, every Torah thought that he has is imbued with the influence of his Rebbe. And then Rabbi Yehuda sitting in the audience and was, like you said, was very, very moved. When he gets back to Prague, he's immediately appointed to the Bezdin of Prague. We'll talk about that in a moment. The Bezdin, which is called by it's Bezdin Moshe. We have to discuss why it's called the Bezdin Moshe. But he also, and that's what he's famous for, and he occupies that position with great distinction for the rest of his tenure in Prague. But he also, which is what he wanted, like you just read, he wanted very much to be able to teach, so he runs his own little yeshiva. He has a circle of Talmidim, and that he keeps up until the year 1817, which is when he suffered a stroke. About 9 years before he died, he was teaching. So in his mind, the main focus was his teaching in Prague, not necessarily his work on the Bezdin.
Correct. And I don't know if you want to talk about the Bezdin Moshe now, and what it means and what the theories are, and you have your own theory that you put in the front of the Teres Chaim that I published a new edition of Elazar. We put the old Haskamas, and one of them was the Prague edition. There was Haskama there from before this, century before this or so, and we put it in there. And you put, I made you add at the end Hagam, which is what your acronym is, and I still got comments. Someone was sending me long emails that I'm wrong. I don't talk about it. I said it wasn't me, it wasn't my theory, but it's a theory, definitely interesting theory. So perhaps now you can say what your theory, what is accepted to mean, and what your theory of it is.
Well, we do know that it was a puzzle to very many people, and there's articles written about it because it was unique. What does Bezdin Moshe mean? And after a while, the thesis which gained traction was that Moshe is Rosh Tevis for Moira, because some of the times you see it it's spelled with the apostrophes, so between the Vav and the Shin. So people understood it to mean that it's Bezdin Moira Shaveh. And Moira Shaveh means that all the Dayanim are equal instead of Maschilim and Atzad, where there's a senior Dayan and another Dayanim. In this Bezdin, everything is equal. That's what people understood it to be. I mean, again, it was a puzzle, but they believe that was the resolution of the puzzle. When I was researching the Haskamas for the Teres Chaim, it struck me that in some of the older documents, it's Bezdin Moshe, and then it says Apelantin. And Apelantin means appellate in Latin, and also often with apostrophes, and it just struck me that maybe the word apostrophes were used for Rosh Tevis, for acronyms, but apostrophes were also used for Latin words, for words that were las or not foreign words that were not Hebrew were marked with the apostrophes. So it suddenly struck me that maybe the word Moshe really means mos appelantin, which is another Latin word for meaning, small claims court or something like that. A different designation for the court in Latin, which was then forgotten because they didn't speak Latin. Even though they kept it on their letterhead, so to speak, they kept it on the masthead because the generations before them, but they had forgotten the meaning, which then led the way for alternate interpretations. So some of the feedback that we got relates to Dayanim themselves, who will sometimes spell it out Moira Shaveh, which doesn't mean that was the original interpretation, because often when people forget an interpretation and the new one is adopted, so then people will adopt it. A parallel to that is the famous Samach test that Sfarim often did, historians do, sign at the end of their name, which was mistakenly interpreted to mean Sfardi Tohar, meaning not of Marano descent. But and even though some Sfardim will tell you that's what it means, it doesn't mean that was the original interpretation. Mark Shapiro and others have proven, and I've added some rayas on my own, that it didn't mean that originally. Originally, it meant something like Seifei Toiv or Seifei Tav. It was like a bracha that someone would wish on himself to live out his years in good health and prosperity. So, but that meaning was forgotten, and it took on another meaning. So it doesn't mean just because a meaning is later accepted that was the original meaning. And that was the theory I put out there about Bezdin Moshe, which is neither here nor there, but it's out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory, and it's a theory, and whether it's right or wrong, it's definitely an interesting Bezdin, which this always comes up and is discussed. So, like you mentioned, Rabbi Elazar Fleckles joins this Bezdin. It's a position that he'll be on the rest of his life as one of the members of the Bezdin. As we'll talk about after Noda Yehuda's death, he doesn't become the Rav of Prague. In fact, I think the next chief rabbi is Shir, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, and there is no chief rabbi. There's Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, there is Shmuel Landau, the son of the Noda Yehuda, there's Michal Bakrak, there's some others, but there's no chief rabbi of Prague. But we're jumping ahead. We can walk back before we get to the death of the Noda Yehuda. At that point, Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is in Prague, and he starts publishing Svarim, and he publishes his works of homiletics. I'm looking at you created a very handy, perhaps we'll publish this somewhere with this series. You publish a very handy timeline, a little breakdown of Elazar Fleckles' life, and you write the work of homiletics, which is really what it was, the Eilos Chodesh, and that's really, if you read his style, that's really like his style of writing. And he has Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Chazayin L'Moyed. Avos David is a whole nother type of work. We also forget Malachas HaKodesh, which is unique. So he really has many unique svarim. Shuv Me'ava is the most classic in ways, and it's a different kind of Shuv Sefer in many ways as well. But yeah, he does publish with a glowing haskama of the Rabbi Yehuda, and he follows it by the additions. So, in the next part of his life, as you mentioned, then the Rabbi Yehuda is nifter, and he then takes on more responsibility in the Bezdin. And I do want to read an interesting quotation that I think is worth noting. There was a biography written about like Prague and the Rabbanim of Prague, and it was published in old volume, I think Historia Judaica, and this is printed in like 1950s, and it was that's actually the English translation, that is, by Rabbi Gutman Klemperer, and so this I didn't find this. Rabbi Dr. David Katz of Baltimore, who wrote the PhD on the Rabbi Yehuda, the expert in Prague, he sent this to me.
Called him, I think, right?
Yeah, he sent this to me a couple of years ago, and it's a fascinating document to read, actually a really interesting read. So he first talks about the Nidud. I mean, there's other parts earlier and later, but the point that's relevant to us is he talks about once the Nidud is nifter. So he says that once the Nidud is nifter, he talks about Rabbi Elazar Fleckles and Rabbi Shmuel Landau. So that he talks about, by the way, the different courts and so on, and he talks about them. After the demise of Rabbi Cheskel Landau, there was no chief rabbi that was appointed. So you have the head of the Bezdin, and that was who became basically in charge. And the board, it said, was Michal Bakrak, Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, and Rabbi Shmuel Landau. And he said they all had different functions. Michal Bakrak had the register of births and deaths and so on. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles supervised the orphanage. Shmuel Landau was in charge of the preparation of kosher meat, the shechita, which was a big deal. Interestingly to note about Prague, and we're going to get to this with Avos David, there was a strong Sabbatian Frankist movement there, and the Yehuda was very busy with this. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, Avos David, the whole book is written against the Franks and the Sabbatians. So this was, they were always there hiding. And so, in fact, Justice Louis Brandeis on the United States Supreme Court was descended from a Prague Sabbatian family. So this was something that was going on in Prague. But there was, the Rabbanim were always very busy with it. They were busy with the government. There was a big tumult, and there was a long fight. There's a whole story. It's a whole story. Michal Bakrak was arrested, and then he got out of jail. And when he got out of jail, he opened his window and he said, "A fire from hell shall come down upon them." He died 2 months later, and then a few weeks later, a fire broke out in the home of one of the Sabbatians. And then it kept going. It was a huge fire. This was there was a big story in Prague. So
and these fights would spill out into the street. In Avos David, Rabbi Elazar talks about how at one point, after one of the drushes that he gave against the Frankists, they romped and rioted through the streets, beating up any Frankist they can find.
Yeah, Avos David is you can see it in there. We'll get to that. Okay, but what I really wanted to mention as it pertains to them is that he discusses Rabbi Elazar Fleckles and Shmuel Landau, and he said that there was a conflict between them, and they both wanted to be in charge, be the Rav. They basically wanted to be in charge. So he said he explains the differences between them, I think, which is fascinating to see. He says Rabbi Elazar Fleckles was a Baki, Rabbi Shmuel Landau was a great Charif. And you can see this, I think, in their Svarim as well. He said also they differed greatly in their method of teaching halacha. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, by the way, it's in the English they wrote Eliezer, but Elazar. I don't know. It should just say Elazar.
I think that's just a Germanic way of writing it.
Yeah, that's right. They mean to say Elazar. So it says Rabbi Elazar Fleckles rejected the pilpul, which often relegates truth to the background. He was also quite opposed to the so-called chilukim. It says Rabbi Shmuel Landau, on the other hand, defended their use by maintaining that even if it was true that pilpulistic discussions were not conducive to truth, they were still extremely useful. They attracted the talented student and enhanced his interest in the study of Talmud. They might also be regarded as an effective medium for analyzing the very essence of halacha, thus contributing to its fuller understanding. And he said, in the course of this controversy, he gave an excellent definition of the technical expression, Jerusha and Chiluk, and you can read on, and he's this is Rabbi Yehuda, his father. Darish, let's see, he's busy. This is his pilpul. So this was, again, maybe this also has to do with Poland versus Prague, where they came from.
I mean, I don't know. Say that the Rabbi Yehuda probably had both of them. If you look through Rabbi Yehuda is very colorful, very rich, very linguistic, very conscious of history and Girsois and Rishonim and the Tkufa, but also Feshtetzach, full of great lamdas. And like you said, the Darish Tzin, was one of the biggest pieces of pilpul you'll ever run into.
So he says Rabbi Samuel knew the value of the causatic method in which he was a master much superior to Rabbi Elazar. The opposite picture offered itself in the field of Haggadah. In homiletics, in which at the time the Haggadic method had gained importance, Rabbi Elazar was a master. His sermons were distinguished by splendidly chosen texts and fine allegories, and were especially impressive through their unusual rhetorical quality. On the pulpit, this rabbi had the audience completely in his power. He knew how to move his listeners to tears, yet occasionally, as on the eve of the new moon of the month of Shvat, his witty remarks caused general amusement and occasional laughter. Rabbi Samuel's sermons were dry and usually of little significance. So you can see the difference between the two. They had these two Rabbanim, great Gainim, and they were very different in style, which is very interesting. He said the same difference, this is something we'll talk about perhaps soon, the same difference in traits characterized their modes of thinking. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles was strictly conservative, as was Rabbi Cheskel Landau. He threw his full weight against Mendelssohn's Bible translation, stating that he preferred to limit the teaching of the young, mainly Talmudical subjects, with just enough secular study to satisfy the needs of daily life, and so on and so forth. However, having engaged in some secular studies himself, Rabbi Shmuel Landau expressed himself to the effect that they were useful. He fully approved of teaching the Bible with the help of the New German translation, and even advised a woman to use Eichel's German translation of the prayer book. However, he condemned the growing religious apathy of the private tutors, and so on. And so they're very different. And again, Rabbi Shmuel Landau was the son of the Noda B'Yehuda. And in fact, I don't know if it's Shmuel Landau's son or the next generation. The Noda B'Yehuda's grandson publishes a full edition of the Be'er there. It's his nephew in Prague. So you see, so on the one hand, you have his son is different, but then you have the Talmud Muvak. You have this, I think, similar to the Chassam Sofer and the Ksav Sofer is the same. I think the Chassam Sofer's Talmidim were a little bit more extreme than the Ksav Sofer was, I believe.
Yes.
Even though that's not the topic at hand, same type of thing plays out here in Prague. But we can get back to Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, but I thought there's much more there. It's a fascinating read. It's like a real primary source. It's very interesting to read. I don't know where he got all this from, but you can see the difference from Elazar Fleckles and Shmuel Landau.
Yeah, Moshe Landau, the publisher, is a son, I think, of Rabbi Yehuda Landau, or maybe Rabbi Avram. It's a nephew of Rabbi Shmuel. I think his father was a businessman. I think he's called a Gvir. But this Moshe Landau, in the next generation in Prague, is a famous publisher and somewhat maybe of the Maskilik bent. You know, a very close contemporary of Shir, that you mentioned earlier, an associate of his. And Moshe publishes also a German translation of Tanakh together with Yoel Brill. Yoel Brill is a very close Talmud of Mendelssohn. So the hisnagdus of the Tshuva Me'ava to Mendelssohn has to be understood in the light of the fact that he gives a haskama, and Elazar, I got to credit Elazar Brut, he wrote a fascinating article on this in Svarim blog a while ago, but he brings this haskama to Moshe Landau's edition of with a German translation, and there Rabbi Elazar writes, he says, my Rebbe was opposed to the translation of Mendelssohn for the reason that the language was highfalutin. The highfalutin language is not a tayelis for young people trying to understand the Torah. It's a tayelis for young people, which is a common rabbinic response to the beer. That was the main problem people had with the Be'er, was the language, the choice of language, and the motive for that choice of language. It was to teach people High German to help ease them into fine society, fine German-speaking society, and that was not a tayelis in the eyes of the Rabbanim, but the tayelis of understanding the Torah in the vernacular was important to them. And another problem, which is a technicality he has with Mendelssohn, is that the Mendelssohn translation is not literal. That's what he writes there. It gives you the sense, but it's rewritten. He prefers this one, that Moshe Landau, together with Mendelssohn's Talmud, Yoel Brill. He says, "Bimei Yoel." This happened. He writes such a lashon there. Like you said, the Melitza is scintillating. But he does say there that that's why he prefers a new translation, which more in line with what he's thinking. It's important to understand that at the time that we're talking about, Mendelssohn is not the other yet. A lot of hashkafa is predicated on us and them. There's nothing wrong with that. Part of shoring the base and circling the wagons is understanding who's in and who's out. But at the time of this writing, Mendelssohn is very much in. And Rabbi Elazar himself relies a lot on the beer. He used it, learned it, and quotes it a lot in his Melechus HaKodesh, the other sefer you mentioned. So Mendelssohn is still part of the Machna. You could be misnagid, you could be opposed to it, but he's not michutz l'Machna at the time of this writing. And that's why Mendelssohn and the Chevra are people that Rabbi Elazar knows and interacts with. So even though he has a snagdus to certain aspects of the beer, he also, I think, doesn't like the way he transliterates Hashem's name. He mentions a few different things, not transliterates, the way he translates. Mendelssohn came up with a mechudish way of translating the name of Hashem the Oiviger, I think he did, some people liked it, some people didn't like it. Brill himself does use it, so it did stick. Although Rabbi Elazar was opposed to it, but it's just you have to put the opposition in perspective. It's possible the Noda himself, I think Elazar talks about this as well, that the Noda himself at an earlier time was taken by the beer. It's only later, upon reflection, he saw faults with different aspects of it. But again, it didn't mean that they weren't writing Mendelssohn Michutz Lamachana. They're misnagid as if you would be misnagid to somebody within who did something that you feel is a bad decision and wrong. But Rabbi Elazar is adored by all factions of Prague society. The more modern, the more liberal-minded, they see Rabbi Elazar as someone they can talk to, someone who understands them, and also someone who's committed to the ideals of Torah.
Except the Franks.
That's correct.
That they are the bane of his existence, and I'm sure he was the bane of their existence. He did not like them, to say the least. You can check out Avos David, a wonderful new edition. By the way, a fascinating sefer to read.
Yeah.
Avos David. Highly recommended.
Yeah. So again, getting back to the timeline. So contrary to late, I always remember Reb Meir Simcha writes that his father he had the Meshech Chochmah written early and he wanted to publish it, but his father told him don't publish first a sefer on drush, because then you're always going to be known as a darshan. First publish a sefer on halacha, and then later put out the drush in Lita in circa late 1800s, around 1900, Drush is very much secondary to halacha, and that's why he got the advice that he did. But in Rabbi Elazar's case, it's the exact opposite. Like in that quote that you just read, Drush is very, very important, and therefore Rabbi Elazar first publishes his Sifrim on Drush already starting in 1785, while the Noda was still alive, and then again in 1786, the second volume. In 1793, the year that the Noda dies, he publishes his third volume. He only publishes Halachas for much later. In 1809 is when he publishes the first volume of Tshuva Me'ava, and then another volume in 1815, and the third volume in 1821. But it's just, again, a sign of the time. He was definitely a goyin, and his tshuvas are still very relevant, very important, very chashiv, but at the time, drush was there was a strong demand for good drush, and his drush was of the absolute very, very best quality. The year that he publishes the first volume, in 1809, is a very significant year in his life, because that's when his fortunes take a turn for the worse. He suffers a lot. That year, his daughter died, a beloved daughter, the wife of Reb Itzik Spitz, who is the father, I think, of the one writing this Zichron Elazar. She was only 30 years old, and she passes away then, which causes him a lot of suffering. He himself has a medical episode, maybe some kind of stroke, which gives him, almost handicaps him on his right side, his writing side, which is incredible because he still publishes a lot of Sfarim after that. But he's almost handicapped, and he has to spend every year now for the rest of his life. He spends a few months every year in a little vacation spa town called Teplitz. But he doesn't, even on vacation, even in Teplitz, he's very busy, and there's even an official government letter written in Prussian, reproduced in the Zichron Elazar, but omitted in photo offsets in order to weed out any Haskalah-looking thing. They took out anything not in Hebrew letters. They erased. So it's you have to find the original Zichron Elazar. You'll see there's a letter there from the governor's office attesting to Rabbi Elazar's efforts there on helping the destitute Jews who needed to rehabilitate there, to give them the financial backing that they need. He stayed very busy and always involved in chesed. So that was a very difficult year. A few years later, in 1812, his first wife Esther suddenly passes, adding suffering to his already very difficult situation. And he writes that his only respite is learning Torah, and that's why he writes, at that point, he writes a Sefer Melechus HaKodesh. He says he needed to focus on something new and something original, so he published a Sefer Melechus HaKodesh. The tachlis of Melechus HaKodesh, again, at a further point in these episodes, you should be able to talk more about the individual Sfarim, but Melechus HaKodesh is an original Sefer dedicated to determining and helping the Sefer know which names of Hashem in the Chumash are Kaddish and need to be written B'Kedusha, and which are not. We know that the word Elohim can be used for Dayanim, for Malachim, besides for just being a name of Hashem. So very often the word needs to be clarified, and he does it with the great Bekiyas that you mentioned earlier. with some pilpul, some lumdis. It's a fascinating sefer. So he needed he writes the sefer in 1812 as a respite from the emotional distress that he had been experiencing. A year later, he remarries in 1813. But that second wife that he remarries goes blind and now becomes another dependent on him. But to his credit, he never complains. He never lets his spirits lag, and he continues to learn and write and work and publish.
Yeah, and then eventually a few years later, in 1818, he publishes the work on the Haggadah, which is Ma'aser Rabbi Elazar, a wonderful Haggadah. In fact, those interested in looking for a interesting and new original Haggadah, for those that aren't familiar with it at this point, it's a really terrific Haggadah. Machon Netzach Yaakov did a great job on the Haggadah as well. And then he's still active. He's publishing more Sfarim. Again, he publishes Chodesh Lishi, which has Spadim in it, on the Neder Yehuda and others. And then in 1826, he's nifter on Pesach. So actually, this year is his 200th yahrzeit. This Pesach, it's not clear. There's some discrepancy about what exactly is which date of Pesach is exactly his yahrzeit, but he's nifter at some point on Chol Hamoed, Shvishal Pesach, and so his yahrzeit is definitely on Pesach.
And he makes, before he dies, there's a poignant episode there described in the Zichron Elazar about how he had a son that had become a wealthy. Very often, the sons of Rabbanim would do a shidduchim with wealthy, important Baal-Batim, and then if the son wasn't holding by learning, the son would join the shver's business and kind of move with ease in high society to another kind of important position. So this son, Avram Meir, the son of the Tshuva Me'ava, is a wealthy and important person in his own right. He comes on Pesach to visit with his father, and Rabbi Elazar is very satisfied that he manages to say goodbye to Gezek and Zach with his son, and he makes the amazing declaration. Apparently he knows his time is coming, and he writes that in his life, he doesn't remember ever sinning, doing any kind of aver b'mezid against anybody. And incredibly, he says he was very poor most of his life. It's only when he started assuming, in early 1800s, where he started assuming more communal responsibilities and he started earning a larger paycheck. For the first time in his life, he was able to afford his daily expenses. Till then, he was living as a pauper, an absolute pauper. But he still says when he dies that he doesn't owe anybody money. There's never anybody that he hasn't repaid. And he leaves over in his tzavah that he only wants those who loved him in his lifetime, because every Rav has it. In Prague, it wasn't as rosy as it had been in a little town in Goitain. Not only the Frankists, but there's just still the politics of running a big city, making it possible. There were those who maybe it was financial. Throughout this Zichron Elazar, there's mention of people that showed him enmity, but it's never spelled out. I imagine it has to do with giving a hechsher for this guy or dintire against that guy. It's never entirely clear, but he does stipulate that he only wants those who had loved him, those who are close to him. Those are the ones who should be metapel him. Contrary to the common trend of Achari Mois Kedoshim Emor, where people who had shown him enmity in life, but to pad their standing in the community, now want to pretend that they were very close with the Rav. He said no, he doesn't want that taking advantage of him. He also leaves over an ethical will, and he mentions a few things in there. He says he wants those who are named for him should be named the exact name that he carried. His name was Elazar. He wants it to be used Elazar. He doesn't want them using names in vernacular or anything else. It's an interesting thing. And he does use this ethical will as an opportunity to something which was important. When you mentioned that earlier, Nachi, from that quote, he wants the Chinuch Habanim do not engage excessively in biblical studies, and he doesn't want abridgments of biblical books. These are the don't engage. You're going to be involved in publishing and teaching. Do not anthologize the biblical books. You got to teach Chumash straight from the Chumash. And
that's done because he says, so my sons and daughters, he says, be on the yard site, don't fast on the yard site, please don't fight because of Kaddish. And he says to learn Mishnayos and say Tehillim and so on. The next part is, all generations, Gidlu b'neichem ala Gemara v'apoiskim. Bring them up on Gemara and Poiskim. Manu b'neichem and a mikra. Withhold from the mikra. Obviously, it doesn't mean don't learn Tanakh. It means don't overdo it. V'zaru ma'oid shalai tilmudu as b'neichem sfarim hamalaktim sifra Tanakh. What you just said, no collections of sfarim on Tanakh. Im toivu v'shematim oz toivu lachem kol yamim. It is segula. He says, if you listen to me, it'll all be good. It says, divrei avichem Elazar Fleckles. And furthermore, in the Netzach Yaakov, and you can find this I'm looking here in the Oilers Chodesheni, but it's in the other farm as well. They have a fascinating Ksav Yad that's owned by the Machon, which goes through the Levaya and the whole, from the Petira until the Levaya, of what had the whole full story about what happened until they buried him. And it's reading about a Levaya, but it's fascinating that we have that someone actually wrote up this document, this primary source, that you can read the whole story about the Levaya and exactly what was going on and who he was taking him and so on and so forth.
I think it's worth also talking about some of the characteristics of the Tshuva Me'ava as described by his grandson in the Zichron, Elazar. Again, I recommend those. Find the scan of I think Google Books has one. Some of the little tiny details you may have fallen prey to censorship, or maybe it didn't come out in a scan you may find. So go back to the original. Of course, like you said, his most obvious talent that on display was his homiletical ability. He spoke publicly during his heyday when he was healthy. He spoke about 10 times a year. Before Slichas, before Tisha B'Av, and in the Sefer it says when he would speak where. In Kol Nidre he would speak by the Klois, and it's very interesting for the history of Darshanis. But later, as his health started failing him, he wasn't able to speak quite as much. He still tried to speak 3 times a year, and people from all over, not only Prague proper, but even the little hamlets around Prague, when they knew he was darshing, he would come because, like you said, he was spellbinding and full of original, sparkling insight. His personality, the grandson writes, he was a loving and cheerful person, and it's in his farm. It's all over his farm. His love for other people, constantly, like I mentioned it earlier, that's a trait he claims he picked up from the Noda B'Yehuda, but his interpersonal relationships were exquisite, perfect. He was also, of note, committed to loving all mankind. The beginning of Tshuva Me'ava has a long essay.
Carl Fisher, the censor. We've talked about him, but talk about him.
Not only are there Tshuvas to Carl Fisher, there's in the archives, there's letters to and from, Rosh Hashanah greetings. Carl Fisher was the official government censor of all Prague publications. Prague was an important Hebrew publishing house. Everything had to get the approval of Carlos Fisher, appointed by the government, a Christian who could ascertain that the contents of the Sefer are not offensive to the government or offensive to the state religion. So that was the purpose of the censor. Carl Fisher spoke and wrote Hebrew. He wrote some of the letters on his Rosh Hashanah greeting cards to Rabbi Elazar are written in Hebrew. So he actually looked at the Swarm. Sometimes the government censors had to rely on Jews, like the Tugendholder brothers we once discussed a while ago in connection with Teres Chaim. But some of them could read Hebrew, and Carl Fisher is one such example. So he was in close contact with Rabbi Elazar. Besides for the censorship of the books, there was also a lot of government business which required interaction with the Rav. There are some of these artifacts out there. They're very prized collectibles, but sadly the Jews weren't trusted in the courts unless because they couldn't be trusted. The Goyim suspected that the Jews would fudge it for the Goyim. So in order to preclude that, the Yidden would have to take a Shavua on a Chumash. So the courts had an official Chumash, sanctioned by the rabbi and the censor. So I've seen a few of these in private collection. They go up on auction every now and again. The Oath Chumash. It's something very often the ones in Prague, which is where the Kuf we're talking about under Rabbi Elazar Fleckles. Every year I think they have to renew it or so. So there's a lot of these Chumashim, but they're highly prized. But it's a recurring thing every year. There'd be the official government certificate signed by Carlos Fisher, and then a signature of Rabbi Elazar Fleckles on another paper. So they had a lot to do with each other. There was one case, and I think Mark Shapiro wrote an article about this, a very interesting article where Carl Fisher asked Rabbi Elazar about Nittelnacht, and Rabbi Elazar answered. That's the subject of Mark's article. Was his answer upfront, or was he being evasive? It's important to know that Rabbi Elazar, of all people, emphasized being honest and truthful to Goyim. When he wrote, very often Halacha Svarim will have that disclaimer that anything about Goyim in the Sefer doesn't refer to the Goyim among who we live. In the case of Rabbi Elazar, he writes a whole essay to bolster that point, which would be completely unnecessary if it was just a Menasaf of Elachutz. It's obviously something that was important to him, and And that's the beginning of Tshuva Me'ava, has that very long essay about this. So it was important to him being on good relationship and loving and kind to all people, including non-Jews.
Do you want to mention also about that tshuva? I mean, this will be the episode dedicated to tshuva me'ava. We'll really talk about this and other things, but just to touch on it here about the kalir, he talks about the piyutim.
Oh, that shows you the breadth and the education that he had. Although it's funny, the rabbi that you were quoting feels that he was not as exposed. That Rabbi Shmuel was more exposed to maybe secular learning. But in that tshuva, Rabbi Elazar goes through all the sources, everything available. It's a real chashuva research piece on who the kalir was. He's careful not to say anything against the Bali Taisus refer to.
Rabbi Yaakov Emden argues on that Taisus. That Taisus, right. Rabbi Yaakov Emden is right over there.
Rabbi Yaakov Emden has no hesitation about rejecting it. Rabbi Elazar Fleckles is a lot more kind and charitable, but he does explore everything with a very refreshing look. He was also a very doting parent. He, like I said, how it was so important to him that he got to say goodbye to his son. In later years, living with his second wife, who was a dependent on him, he would take great consolation whenever his children would come visit him. And the grandson writes, and this is not to be found in the photo offset, but it's in the original. He says his children reciprocated, and they would give up spending time in the coffee shops and in the theaters to spend time with their Zayda. I think Rabbi Elazar talks about coffee. It was become a culture.
Coffee shops were a big deal. Also, coffee shop was think of an internet cafe.
Right.
Or this was like, it was not just like going to drink coffee.
Right. It was becoming a thing.
It was the hub. And people, there's a problem on Shabbos. They would go to the coffee shop on Shabbos, the hack, whatever was going on over there. It was a problem.
Right. There's a theme in some of his farms. He was opposed to it, but still his own grandchildren, which is the way things, unfortunately, a sign of those times. So his own grandchildren would give up their time to spend time with their Zayda. He was very, very fond of his three son-in-laws. One of them we mentioned is Rabbi Spitz. That's the father. That is the father of this the biographer Yom Tov Spitz. Yom Tov Spitz himself was a teacher of Hebrew and German in a community-run preparatory school in Prague. That was his job. But he writes Hebrew pretty well, and he writes the biography of his grandfather. His father, Rabbi Itzik, who's involved in publishing, I believe, too. He was very, very fond of him. And the grandson notes that Rabbi Elazar made it a point that financial considerations play no role in picking intelligent and Yirei Shamayim for his daughters. That's what was important to him, not financial, what they bring to the table. Financially, another son-in-law was Reb Feischleib Friedlander, who was also the father-in-law of this Yom Tov Spitz, and Reb Itzik Hamburger, one of the very Talmud Chacham in Prague, famous. He was a Balabas, but a very famous Balabas. Another person, a family member that he was very close with, was his brother Wolf. Wolf Fleckles was one of the community dignitaries, being a Prague blue blood as he was, and he was very, very close with his brother. His brother showed him great deference. Another trait that the grandson highlights is his humility. Despite his great learning, he was gracious to everybody and anybody, rich, poor, young, old, didn't matter to him. He was kind to everybody. He was a big Baal Chesed. He gave freely to tzedakah. People were always lining up outside his door because they knew they can expect a little donation, and even more importantly, a listening ear. He would go every single winter. He had a habit all his life. He would go with some of the important Baal Batim when it was winter, when it was cold outside and people didn't have proper heating and proper homes, the poor people. He would go and raise money for them. He loved nature, which you can understand when you read his Melitza, you see what kind of poetic soul he has, and he loves to take walks, and he would always use it to give praise to the Eibishter for making this amazing thing, that amazing thing. Another feature, which I want to point out, is he used this position as Rav in Prague and an important preacher. He would always express loyalty and admiration for the Austrian emperor. He had met him a few times. The grandson writes he had met him once on the emperor's birthday in 1806. During the Napoleonic Wars between 1813 and 1814, he was very, very, very patriotic and gave a lot of drushes about this. When the emperor was sick in 1826, he gave another drusha. It was just shortly before he himself passed away. But it was very loyalty to the government, loyalty to the emperor were important themes in that run through his personality and that are very ably expressed in his drush.
So Rabbi Elazar Fleckles, as we said, many Sfarim. Tshuv Me'ava, which is now coming on this beautiful new edition, is really his. I think that's of his Sfarim, the well-known Sfarim, and that's really his magnum opus, the crown jewel of his Sfarim. If you even though the other ones Sfarim are wonderful, the Haggadah and the Drush Sfarim and Avas David, and these Sfarim will flesh out later on episodes. There'll be a full episode dedicated to Tshuv Me'ava. Also, all the Sfarim are linked to in the show notes. If those interested can purchase them, they should be available in Sfarim stores. But what would you say Rabbi Elazar Fleckles' legacy is?
His legacy is definitely, like I said, he's going to be remembered forever for being the primary Talmud of his Rebbe, of the Noda B'Yehuda, in the question of Shiurim, which is relevant till today. There's new books, new Sfarim. They're always talking about Shiurim. The Noda B'Yehuda is a very big Chiddush in Shiurim, which are much larger than other Shiurim. Everybody will always remember the famous quip that the Tshuva Me'ava tells his Rebbe. He's like, well, Rebbe, you're very tall and you have very long arms and long fingers, so maybe that's why your Shir Etzba is longer than everyone else. Your Shir Gudel is longer. He writes that his Rebbe appreciated that joke, but especially with the publication of the Tshuva Me'ava, he will be, which is, the Sefer has been impossible to find, but people will now recognize and learn and study and benefit from his position as a gadol, as one of the Moisrei HaTorah, and a very important posek. His drush will always be learned because it's timeless and it's delicious and historical value and Torah value. The Haggadah, those Sfarim are great, but I think the Tshuva Me'ava, his name is, he's known as the Tshuva Me'ava, and I think with the publication of the new Tshuva Me'ava, people will learn who exactly he is. They will see, and Tamu Ru'u Ki Toiv, this is a wonderful sefer from a very important gadol.
Okay, well, thank you, Moshe, for joining me, and thank you to Machon Netzach Yaakov for sponsoring this episode.